I'm wearing my wired headphones today so that I can knock that lag down. Just
whoa,
an extra, 10 milliseconds or whatever. I bought 2 pair because I was like, I know Charlie's going to get out these things. Literally, I left the first pair plugged in overnight. Next morning, it's just chewed in half.
It's gone.
It's just. So I was like, glad I bought.
Charlie busts out the scissors. She's like, it's time.
Bscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 371 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the tools programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm the artist.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today is July 8th. 2020. Before we get started, we have a warning. Anything could happen on this show, especially swear words.
Yeah.
There's going to be 29 of them.
Yep.
And they
Per
will be
person.
the only words we use. So you said eighth. Is that
Eighth.
Eighth. Is that?
Yeah, that has to be the correct.
I usually say I put like a what do you call it? Pallated, whatever. I put a T. There's like,
Eighth.
Yeah, I say eighth.
Hard T. Yeah.
A hard T in there. And now I'm like, how does everybody else say it?
I mean, that would only make sense if it was EIGHTTH.
That's a good point.
You know, it's not eighth, it's eighth.
That's true.
And the G is, of course, silent, or maybe it's not silent. We've been doing it wrong.
I think
all the
the
time. It's
GH causes. I think the GH is a stand-in because it's not actually silent. It's pronounced as a T sound. That's why it's eighth.
the G is a it's a temporary T.
Yeah.
But wouldn't it just be
But that-
8 at that point?
Oh wait, no, it's
Because now
EI.
it's 2 T's in a row.
Wait, isn't it? It's EIGHTH.
GHTH. Yeah. So that first for that GH is a T sound. That's how
Oh, the first GH is a T sound.
Yeah.
What the fuck, English?
I got you.
Get out of here.
That makes sense. That tracks.
What are we even doing?
I don't know, man.
I don't know.
Who knows?
I don't
We're just trying to get by, you know?
We're just hanging in there, man.
When our words are spelled this way, how could you expect anything to work out?
How can we get anything done? I always have those moments where I'm programming and I have a variable name that'll be something like that. One of these words is kind of spelled kind of weird, you know.
You see it too many times.
And then I type that word 20 or 30 times and I just keep looking at it all day, and eventually it just turns inside out, and I can't comprehend it anymore, and it's over.
There are some words that I still cannot. I always have to spell it the wrong way. One of those is receive, and another one is relevant. I always flip the E and the A on the back half of it.
Vent.
I can't. Yeah, I still can't remember which way it goes.
It's like electricity vent. You know,
Vant.
it's a vant. It's a real
Because you
vant.
say it as vent, but it's actually vant. You know, it's confusing.
Fucking English, God.
I can spell relevant if I don't think about how it's spelled, but as soon as somebody says, "Oh, how is this spelled?" then I will start to flip it in my mind.
I thought it was RALAVEIGHNT. GHTH. Relevant.
Fucking GHTH. Get out of here. Get out of here. Anyways, we would also like to thank our supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. We've got a donation from Degeki who says, missed a few months, so here's a handful of monies to throw around. Just don't go Scrooge McDuck in it. That won't end well. Which is true. There's those scenes where Scrooge, leaps into his vault full of coins, and he just dives into it like a swimming pool, as if a giant container just full of metal would somehow behave
like a ball
like a
pit.
Well, and
liquid.
it looks like gold, which is, particularly dense. Although it is a soft metal, so maybe it's like jumping into pillows.
The only thing we can infer from this is that Scrooge McDuck is very hard, like
Yes.
a diamond.
Yeah.
It's probably those compacted feathers, like a penguin sort of
Yeah.
situation.
So relatively speaking, since gold is a soft metal and Scrooge McDuck is a hard duck, it's relatively soft, I think.
He's how he got so rich, living that hard duck life.
That's true.
We'd also like to thank our recurring supporters as well. Thank you very much for the recurring donations. So today's episode's kind of weird because we had a 5-day weekend. Is it a weekend at that point? It's just a break at that point.
Break. Yeah.
Summer break.
So we had our summer break over 4th of July. Don't need to go into it, but we didn't really do a lot of celebrating of America this weekend.
Not a lot to
but we
celebrate.
did go on break. So we did lots of stuff, and we have basically a nail or whiff episode where we're going to talk about some of the stuff that we did over break and whether that stuff nailed it or whiffed. Okay.
And if you're newer to the podcast, the idea of the nail whiff spectrum is to say get away from this whole. Let's put it on a 100-point scale where numbers between 60 and 100 are the only numbers we use, and they mean arbitrary, whatever. And also where what kind of stuff the reviewer likes is the most important, actually. Because here we're talking about for what they were trying to do. Did they nail it?
Did they nail it?
Or did they whiff it? Even if we don't like it, that's not actually part of the puzzle.
Yeah. So as kind of an example, a lot of people are like talking about the new the Diablo Immortal game. Is it good? Is it bad? Blah blah blah. What are the reviews for it? What I want to know is what were they trying to do, and did they nail it?
Yep.
Right.
They did nail it.
And what they were trying to do was make a mobile version of Diablo where you have to spend tens of thousands of dollars in it to be competitive.
And where people
And
would do that.
They fucking nailed it.
Yep.
That's exactly what it is, 100%, right? Now, I personally hate that. So I'm not gonna.
But now that's a separate
I'm not gonna
question.
play it.
Yeah. So now it's.
But
they nailed that, but you hate that, so it doesn't matter.
It's great for what it is, but I hate it.
Yep.
So does that mean it's good or bad? I don't know, but I hate
matter.
it.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't matter because it's not the question.
Well,
If
it's
that's
because
something you're
you
into, then you go play it.
disliking something doesn't convey the property of badness to that thing.
Doesn't mean that it's bad.
The thing can be bad or good on its own, and then you can also hate it or love it because people love all kinds of horrible stuff too. So
Yeah.
like
So in today's episode of Nail or Whiff, we're just going to talk about some stuff that we've done or experienced or seen or whatever, what we think they were going for and whether they nailed it or whether they whiffed it.
Let's go.
So V Rising, I believe Adam has been playing V Rising.
Yep.
He played it over the break.
my wife and I
So
have
what
put
is it?
about 12 hours into it over the break. So this is it's an early access title on Steam only, I believe. I think it came out a few months ago, so it's not.
It's been out for a while.
brand spanking new, but it's very new. And it's I just started seeing people talking about it constantly, which for most early access titles isn't what happens, right? Most of them just kind of it's silent at launch, and then that's it. And so every time you hear about an early access title a lot, then it's probably worth investigating. And so poking around on what they were doing, I was like, oh, this actually looks like a complete game that they're early accessing for unknown reasons, So I was like, it's worth.
It's almost like
diving
a very much a beta. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
yeah. It's not early access. It's like
the
late
content,
early
right? It's like It's like it's late access where the content that doesn't exist yet. So basically, all the stuff that they intend to have seems to be there, but it looks like late game content is still going to be coming out. Basically, yeah. So it's basically it's a survival crafting game where you play as a vampire and you're basically hunting creatures and humans, right? And the gist of the very light story is that for the longest time, humans won the war against the vampires or whatever. For hundreds of years, you've been locked in your coffin or whatever. But for some reason, you're suddenly awake again. And now it's time to get the world back, right? So you can play PvP or PvE, player versus environment. So you can do it co-op or you can do it aggro. And so if you're playing it aggressively, then it's basically like Ark or any of these other kinds of games because you build a castle and other players can basically steal your castle and steal your shit. And so
Typical.
Yeah, your different like vampire factions are basically now trying to like dominate this land, fighting each other while also taking over the land from like the people and stuff.
If only they could work together,
If only.
Their lives would be so much easier.
Yeah, so I can't really speak to the PvP stuff because I don't like that kind of stuff. And my wife and I were playing co-op together, just on our own private server. And so I can speak to that experience, which felt a lot like basically playing something like Ark or Valheim. But but the thing that they've changed so that's like really different is that the combat is a lot more interesting than those games because like an Ark, you're just trying not to die. You're not really, I wouldn't call it combat. You're just like, I've got a weapon and I'm hoping I don't get killed by this T-Rex before I manage
you don't
to
have a
kill
lot
it,
of
right?
tools, right? You're just sort of
Yeah.
like, here's a pointy object and go, either
Yeah.
you die or it dies. And that's kind of the extent of
Right.
it.
And it feels like the combat is about survival still, not about combat, right?
Right.
And Valheim does have some combat. It's still just like you're just swinging swords at things and that's it, right? And so V Rising brings the combat more into like the Diablo kind of camp where you've got spells that you're casting. You can like transmog and turn yourself into things. You got more interesting interaction points, and you get these like vampire skills where you can basically charm somebody and they become your follower, right? Or you can turn yourself into a mouse so you can like run around and nobody will notice that you're there. And like it kind of so they have a lot more interesting ways of interacting with the world. And then it's also a top-down game, so it's 3D. It's 3D game, 3D models and everything, but it's top-down view. So you're not seeing the horizon. You're just seeing down. But you can freely rotate the camera and pan it up and down a little bit. And so combat isn't this really complicated, difficult thing of like moving the camera around so you can see stuff and then basically like triggering spells and attacks and stuff. And so then you just have these like long series of boss fights, basically, just like tons of little boss fights all over the place as you're behind the scenes doing your kind of your standard crafting stuff.
Are the bosses totally unique, for model like
The
attack
bosses
kit, or are they
are-
largely like the same models, slightly different, and then just like elevated attacks of existing?
Yeah, there are a few. So there aren't that many. There's not a wide variation in stuff, but it's enough that it feels like there's a lot. And I think what V Rising did particularly well is it's not that there's a small amount of stuff. There really is a healthy amount of stuff, but it's not as much as you would think there would need to be. And they've managed to make it like really
Stretch it.
really work, like really stretch it because of how they've distributed things and how they kind of have you move through the world. And so some of the bosses, a few of the bosses are basically just bigger versions of stuff you otherwise see, but most of them are just like unique character models that have their own thing going on. And the fights are pretty easy to figure out, but they're still very challenging because it's all about like positioning and trying not to get hit by things that just like really fuck you up. And normally I'm not that into that kind of stuff. I like stuff that's fairly just kind of casual and slow paced and where combat is like just interesting enough, but not really a big deal, but it turned out to be super fun to just like try these fights over. And I think it's because they made every single aspect of the gameplay feel interesting where it mattered. And so you can't go out. So you can go out during the day. And I think so. The cool thing they did is they made it so that all of the rules, right, the rules of the mechanics are kind of opt in. So it's like they give you punishments that feel like they make sense and feel fair for not doing the stuff you're supposed to do, right? But they don't just stop you. So it's not that like, oh, it's daybreak, so now you're dead, or now it's daybreak, so now you get teleported back to your base or whatever. Instead, it's, oh, the sun's coming up, so if you're not inside your castle where you're now covered from the sun, then you can come back home if you want to. You can keep on exploring if you want to. But while doing it, you sure as shit better stay out of the sun. You're staying in the shade as you move, right? And it's forgiving enough that you get like just a tiny touch of shade. Like, so as noon comes up, all the shadows are short, right? So like you're experiencing this conflict as you're trying to move through the world.
Oh, that's cool.
But that also has interesting interactions everywhere else because now when you're out trying to harvest stuff, because trees are what give you the most shade from the sun, right?
But if you chop them down.
But if you chop all the trees down, then the next time Dave comes, you're like, oh shit, I can't actually get through this area now. And so this interesting thing happens where like you need fuckloads of resource. You need like fuckloads of wood. But I always find myself hesitant about cutting down trees, right?
Because it actually means it's a choice that you got to
Because
make.
I think it's one of the things we talk about like with Crashlands and the crafting is like, how do you make it feel like something besides just, oh, I'm just literally mowing down plants. Like I'm just fucking harvesting I'm just destroying this ecosystem, right? How do you make it feel like you're not doing that? And that's the cool thing about this mechanic and how they tie these together, which I don't even know if it was intentional, because I think they were just trying to make a cool mechanic about daytime, right?
It may have been because one of the things you want to solve for, especially in a top-down context, games that are from the side or that are basically more like 3D platforming stuff, if they're in the survival genre, traversal is more interesting in those contexts because you have to you essentially have to jump. It's basically platforming, right? You jump around and stuff or build your way to certain points. And so probably what they're just trying to answer the question which is a similar thing we've done with Crashlands too. Is just how do you make it so that wandering around
is interesting.
It has some texture to it. Yeah, I think it's cool that they solved it in like a phased way, where it's like at certain times of day you're just walking around, but there's this whole different shift. You get that danger feel, but during the daytime, which is sort of a fun.
Well, and this core action, this like core of interaction with the game is like chopping down trees, has other consequences besides just there's not a tree there now, right? But it actually has this new, and also because combat can be blocked by trees and stuff too, right? So, but also your view is blocked. So even though you can see like top down, they kind of cast this like shadowy looking effect in sort of a cone. Like, so if you're on one side of a rock, it'll kind of like cast a thing to the other side to show you the space that you can't see anymore, right? And so you can like
it's a good tension building mechanic.
Yeah, it's like even though you could technically like you would be able to see it from where the camera is, they hide it from you, so you're not exactly sure what's going on there. And then like that coupled with how because they have a road system that you're mostly traversing on, but that's also where the NPCs like do their patrols, And there's like vampire hunter characters that will really fuck your shit up, and so like so you'll just be having a happy jaunt, as you're going somewhere, running around as a wolf or whatever, right? And then because you have that limited view of how far you can see, like all of a sudden
you just like stumble into
into something, right? And as you go through the game, they make these things more and more interesting, more difficult, so that you have these like we've now gotten to this like northern part, which is like 12 hours in, and it's still kind of growing in scope. And now all of a sudden there's different kinds of characters in these like little villages where there's like a torchbearer and a town crier, and like it's like if the town crier sees you, he starts ringing a bell, and that summons more guys, right? Yep. So and they did it in a way where they sort of embrace the fact that it's a game, so they can do this. So like some of the bosses will summon characters, and they're just like sometimes they're armies of the dead, sometimes they're just regular people, but it just pulls them out of the ground. They just like appear, right? They come into existence, and the game doesn't try to give you a reason why that happened, so that they can then have like the town crier start going, and now characters can spawn without having to like run out from the outside of the world,
Yeah.
So the whole thing is it's cleverly done, and they've made it so that you get that open world effect. With still a very strong sense of like progression and like working through crafting tiers while having like all these like boss fights and things, but you never get stuck because they've set it up in such a way that even if you can't like get past a certain thing that's a gate to like the next tier of items or something, there's still a whole bunch of stuff to do. And it's actually designed with the assumption that a lot of what you'll be doing, like as you work through that linear progression part, is spend a lot of time because they didn't lock everything behind that.
Yep.
They just locked some key points, right?
A lot. Yeah.
So you're moving laterally, but also you're still moving like up a lot. But now it doesn't feel like you have to, if that right. Mm-hmm. So the whole way they did all of the mechanisms of what they block when, what they give you access to, and they mostly like even the bosses and stuff. They have this blood altar you can build that you can then use to choose a boss, and like it now makes a marker on your screen that kind of points in that general direction, so you can like find it, right? But you don't have to have that to find the bosses. They're just there, right? So you can still go. But what that blood altar does is it shows you here are the bosses that are within reach of your level. That doesn't mean easy, because like it goes a little beyond where you are. It only shows you those at a time. It gives you like a little summary info of what they are, right? And then you can go out, and so you can just decide, and it shows you what they unlock, so you know what you're gonna get.
Nice.
And so then you have this like cool kind of thing where you're like, oh, like we really need to unlock our iron tier, and like we got to kill this guy to do it though. And so now you're like, so you like your blood scent, and you start like trying to find, but then you don't know exactly because you just know where it's the direction. So then you're like looking at the map, and the map's always present because
this kind of makes me think of like Monster Hunter.
I never played Monster Hunter, but
they've got a mechanism like
beetles that kind of take you to
they're like little sparkly bugs that kind of like
there's a pretty direct though. There's this like very much pathing you through the woods specifically to get to a place. This is essentially saying like it's over.
This just gives you an arrow, basically.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
deal with it.
And so and the terrain is hard to traverse because there's a lot of verticality to it. There's a lot of like giant things you can't work past, and so you have to be moving around things quite a bit. Yeah, and then if daylight, because it takes like the balancing is done really well, so it takes long enough that if you're looking for a boss, there's a really good chance that by the time you get there for the first time in space you haven't explored yet,
too late. It's
like closing in on daytime, and then you have to decide: do we try to get back home? Do we wait it out? Do we keep trying to make our way there? And then you don't even know if a given fight's going to be in the shade or not, because some fights are in the shade and some are not, right? And so then you'll have these other scenarios where you like get into a fight and it's hard and it takes a long time. And you had to get there first. And so like only 2/3 of your night is left. And then you start going. And then like in my case, like I died and my wife was still alive. So she has to do more kiting now. So it's just taking a little longer. Right. And then suddenly daybreak comes and we're like, and they're like, oh no. And then like all of a sudden there's just the whole arena is in sun except underneath these awnings, right, that are small. But so much of the game and fights are about positioning. And so now she's like trying to run under these awnings and stay there, but then still fight, you know? So yeah,
This all sounds very good.
it's all very interesting. So I would give it a solid nailed it. And I think the way that they let you can approach the game in so many ways. Because you can also put it on an easier mode if you don't want to have like the hard combat stuff. And so I think playing co-op with another person in particular, I think playing it by yourself, like most of these games, I think the absence of there being like a story, makes it so that
wearing you down after.
Yeah, I think you need another person to like really enjoy it and get into. Especially for me, I know like if I fight a boss a few times and I just can't beat it, and I'm by myself, I'm like fuck this, you know. So
You're like, whatever.
yeah.
Moving on.
Yeah. So I think that helps. And then PvP, of course, if that's your thing, like, and you like the Arc style, really intense PvP on always online servers, right? Where your body's just still there when you leave and you better hope your castle is strongly defended and somebody else is there to defend it. You know, if you're into that kind of stuff, it seems to do that really well. But if you're not, the PvE is great. And it's super fun. So nailed it, in my opinion.
V Rising, nailed it. Yep. Be a vampire. Go do stuff. Go on a rampage.
Yeah. Well, actually, one of the key mechanics we didn't even mention, but it's very fun conceptually, because it has to be blood focused, right? So you have this like little blood meter in the middle that you use basically to manage some of your vampire skills. For the most part, like things don't need it, but there are a few of your skills like you can convert that pool.
Is the blood
health,
meter
right?
your own blood?
No, that's separate. But you can
like,
convert it, so you can like use it up. But
okay.
The cool thing they did though is they made it that there are different kinds of blood depending on the creature it comes from, right? So like there's creature blood that comes from like wolves and bears and stuff, and then different kinds of people, so like a warrior or a rogue or a worker or whatever, have that different class of blood. And they also have a different quality of blood between 0 and 100%. And so the quality of the blood that you get, and like you can see, like if you hover your mouse over an enemy as you're like exploring or fighting or whatever, it'll show you the blood type and the percent of quality, right? And so then part of like a little mini game within this becomes like trying to get the best blood and try and decide when, right? Yeah, because especially as you're using your blood up, if you got like really good, because like we found 100% rogue blood once, and like so then you're like eking that out to the last. You're like almost have none left, but you want to hold on to every last drop, you know. And so now you're risking death to hold on to it, because they give you these like huge perks that as you move into the higher qualities, the perks depending on the type and the quality keep on going up until you get some pretty. It's like you get like a 15% boost to crit, and like 15% movement speed, like these really huge boosts that you get depending on whose blood
you have to take advantage of it opportunistically, like a vampire. You know, whatever comes along,
and it always comes at a cost, because you got to go into, because you always got to fight, because you have to knock them down to a certain level of health before you can feed on
their
them.
blood.
Right? Yeah, so it's like everything is a little mini
hold
game.
on.
It's good.
Is there horseshoe crab blood? Because I feel like if you're going to make a game, if you're going to make a game where there's like qualities of blood, you know, and then you leave out horseshoe crabs.
That's true.
Who have this insane blue blood.
Copper based, it's not like, iron based, right?
And it has like various medicinal qualities to it, and it's used for all kinds of medical research.
There's like factories that are hooked up to like tons of horseshoe crabs and draining their blood, because it turns out we're basically vampires to them.
Yeah, it's messed up. But the fact is, like, as humans, we even recognize the power of horseshoe crab blood.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then you're telling me you're going to go make a game about vampires where there's like different levels of blood and horseshoe crabs aren't even in the conversation?
Yeah, I think
like,
they did.
What was all this for?
They did more research on vampires than on blood, I think. You know,
Well, someone, if anybody knows those devs, you know,
well, it is
send
early
them a
access.
note. It's early access, so we can get our request in. Get some crab blood, even if it's just crabs. I don't care.
We need a petition, because I feel like if you snack on if you're a vampire and you snack on a horseshoe crab, I think you literally can't die for like 10 minutes probably. If anybody knows those devs, put in a word. There's a lot of horseshoe crabs that are having a real bad day.
They do have a lot of
nothing,
like little stuff that's just there because it's interesting, So like that seems like because like one of the other things that they do is if you pick up silver coins, they just start to burn you. So you got like if you pick it up, it's in your inventory, and you got to get it back out of your inventory so it stops burning you, And so like I don't even know if you can use them for. I don't know if there's some other thing where if you can somehow get silver coins, you can do something with them. I have no idea, but with like something like this where there's like, oh, if you get a horseshoe crab, then X, right? Like there's enough of these little discoveries that it just feels like there's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, what we've been talking about with Crashlands 2 and where we're putting the thing, which is that the reality is that you build a large basic suite of interactions, mainly so that you can violate all the rules you just made, right? Mm-hmm. In a billion interesting little ways. And it just makes things so fun, Yeah,
well, it's
setting on fire. You're like, what the fuck?
Yeah, it's an experience I haven't had before that I can remember of having my inventory feel like it was like a part of the game besides just a thing you put stuff in,
Yeah.
And this is the only dimension along which that happens is like because there are like in Diablo and stuff, right? Like you can have charms and stuff in your inventory and those convey something, right? But I've never had something that felt like it was interacting with me or like where suddenly I'm being like my character is being burnt, right? And it's coming from like my pockets. Yeah. So it's kind of it was a fun, unexpected little twist on the normal process. But yeah, so nailed it. Might not be for you, but they definitely accomplished what they were trying to accomplish. And I think better than most when it comes to these kinds of games.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Hench, the book. On the nail whiff spectrum. Sam, you read Hench over the break, right?
I did. This was a recommendation from Adam prior to break and turned out to be fantastic. So I'll say Hench nails it. What is it?
I also reread it during the break.
Yeah, it's basically a villain origin story, but set in a universe where there's villains and heroes all over the place and kind of like The Boys on Amazon.
It's a lot like The Boys, yep.
Yeah. It's sort of the anti-hero movement that gets started as people start kind of doing the math, basically, on actually how much damage these heroes are causing and how sort of flagrantly they just kind of don't give a fuck about people. So it's very much in the vein of the Boys, and also in terms of how weird or gross it also gets pretty gross at the end in terms of things that happen. So if you're okay with some of that gross violence, basically,
some body horror.
Some body horror, yeah.
A lot of gore.
But largely just it's just a very fun story. So I would highly recommend. Nailed it.
Nailed it.
It's one of my favorite novels. It's like right up at the top of that list.
It's good.
All right. Now I'm gonna talk about Crashlands 2.
What?
Nail or whiff. So we did a playthrough over the break. So this is kind of weird. Because historically, our mechanism by which we would develop the game is like I'm the game programmer, so I implement the stuff into the game, and like Sam and I are co-designing stuff, and we rope in other members of the team from time to time for feedback on things. So Adam gets involved in those times, stuff like that, and we would have these like routine playthroughs where we would then figure out what we want to work on and then iterate on that stuff. But now that we have the game changer, things have changed. The game has changed. Mm-hmm. And what happens instead is now, Sam is able to add all kinds of stuff to the game without me knowing about it or seeing it just ever at all. And so the need to have those constant playthroughs and check-ins to figure out what I need to be doing next to add stuff to the game, those aren't necessary anymore. Things can just go into the game at any time, right? And so I haven't done a playthrough of the game in quite some time. And Sam has been kind of feeling weird because he's been working on it, kind of doing his own thing, but without a lot of collaborative feedback about the things that he's been adding. And it's all been stuff that we have at some point kind of discussed or agreed upon in the past.
Yeah, I'm not just going rogue. It's very much
he's not just doing random stuff.
Everything has been at some point run through basically a conceptual phase and like kind of a details phase that has been agreed upon before I go plug it in. It's just that it like somehow just sort of shows up sometimes now in like a fully baked or almost fully baked form where Seth says just like,
Yeah. So I did the playthrough. So what we don't have in the game is any kind of like a story or questing system yet. And so that was kind of the big sore spot where basically like, you know, Sam basically had to say to me like, okay, just pretend like something in the game has directed you to like acquire these 3 things, right? And so like I can kind of see vaguely on my map where those things are, and my mission, my goal, right, is to go get those things. And so that kind of served as the impetus for me to go out to the world and start exploring, finding these different characters, which are artisans who can craft stuff and do research for you. I started building a base, started fighting all kinds of creatures, and at the beginning, it had like the vibe of Crashlands, just in terms of like the art style and all that stuff, but it still felt pretty generic survival-y, because without all the goofy text and the story stuff, just about every
20 minutes of basically most survival games are the same, right?
They kind of start out the same. Yeah, it's like, oh yeah, you've got like one tool and you can craft like 1 or 2 things.
Slap a rock, you know.
Yeah, and your goals are very, you know, constrained. But over time, it started opening up, and a lot of really interesting things started happening that I had no idea were, you know, gonna be there. A couple of fun things were that we have these creatures out in the world, and they can interact with each other, and they can interact with things in the environment and stuff like that. And so there's these little scuttly creatures that zap and electrocute things.
It's like a honey badger with electricity, basically. It's called an
and they kind of move in packs a lot of the time. And then on the flip side, there's these kind of like dumb creatures that just like they're kind of squishy, and they kind of hop around, and they just kind of like graze on things in the environment. So they just like eat these trees and stuff like that. So one hilarious thing that happened was, as I was running around, I got set upon by a group of these electric ampibaras, and I just got absolutely wrecked. Okay, so I'm kind of terrified of these things, and I'm like, I have no idea how to fight these, because I'm just getting absolutely one shot by them. I know I can fight the kind of dumb derpy slugabuns, the little grazers, right? But I have no idea how to fight these ampibaras. So as I'm running around, I start exploring a new area, and then I come across a single amphibara just off on its own, and it starts chasing after me and zapping and doing all kinds of electric stuff, and I'm kind of having a hard time outrunning it. Okay, so as I'm running, I come across a slugabun, and I'm like, maybe I can get them to fight each other, right? And then I can basically harvest this slugabun's parts without fighting the slugabun. But like, since I have the ampibara chasing me, I might as well try to use it, right? And it worked great. So I was like, okay, let's see how far we can take this. And so I keep running, and then I find a group of 3 slugabuns, and I bring that ampibara in there. It's chasing me still, you know. But I get it to accidentally hit one of the slugabuns, and then they all set upon it. And it takes some damage, but it takes out all 3 of them. And I'm like, oh my God, yes. And so I just kind of am like running and juking my way through the world, being chased by this electric little scuttling beast. And I'm just like mowing down groups of slugabuns without ever like swinging a weapon, you know, myself, which was like a super cool kind of interactive thing. That kind of thing just never existed in the original game. And that was kind of like
Very good.
I was gonna say that there's kind of a unique experience that like, that's the kind of thing that never could have happened in the original game, because we just didn't have that level of, you know, interactability between the creatures and stuff like that.
Yeah. I think we want to support basically player stories, right? In this context, like just things that can happen, and then where you can feel like you're getting a one up on the game in some ways, right? Where you're like, well, I mean, I could just train this ampibara. It's not my pet, but like technically, if it's attacking me, I can sort of, if I'm swift enough, I can use it, right, against other things. But that's a big if, because the funniest part was Seth managed to do this for like 3 or 4 minutes or so, and then misstepped and just got fucking annihilated. Right? And so it's one of those, like, it's a fun little thing that, because we're sort of planning for it, you know, the original game was basically had to be so simplified. We did have a creature combat situation very early on. We've introduced, I think, the 3rd creature back in Crashlands' original development.
Where they could kind of accidentally hurt each other or whatever.
But what we found is that just due to essentially the whole rest of the design of that game, that that one in particular kind of trivialized. It didn't make things more interesting. It just made it so it was always the case that you sort of wanted to get these things to fight each other, and there wasn't too much of a concern because they also wouldn't just kill you outright. There wasn't that big of a power imbalance. And so with how we've tuned things and just the rest of the stack of the designs, we're able to do things now that we just couldn't actually pull off, that then create these little fun, moments that you as a designer, you plan for them on like a high level, a goal, but you can't actually make them happen specifically because the whole point is they're supposed to just show up emergent, right? So it was really fun to see.
Yeah, and then something else that is kind of cool is like we have these mechanisms by which the creatures can have all kinds of different ways of just passively interacting with stuff in the environment. And so for the slugabuns, they go around and they graze on like trees and shrubs and stuff. But every now and then, kind of rarely, so we have these kinds of like mushroom things called explungus, and they just if they take any damage, then they kind of inflate like a balloon, and then they
Explode
pretty quickly. It just explode. And if there's multiple explungus nearby, then one explungus explosion will set off the nearby explungus, and you can end up with this kind of chain reaction of destruction. And the slugabuns are generally like, they're pretty good about respecting the explungus. But every now and then, one of them gets curious and will go nibble on one, which then, of course, causes it to explode. And then the slugabun can either become injured or just be, straight up annihilated, depending on whether there's other explungus around and whatnot. So there were a couple of occasions in my playthrough where I was just running past a slugabun and it was minding its own business, and I was minding my own business, but I didn't realize that it had it was
got
about
its eyes on a explungus over.
It was about to chomp on an explungus, and the explungus was also in my path. So I'm just like casually strolling along, and then suddenly I realize I'm in like an explosion radius, and I have to quickly juke out of the way, and then the slugabun gets just blasted off the face. So
it's been really weird. On to Seth's point about the change in dev here, which is that previously it was the case because Seth was implementing everything like once it was like designed and all the art was done, and then we would sit together and basically implement it, and that would be another 4 or 5 hours kind of like plonking away. And so there was that combined touch on most of these things, and so I didn't necessarily feel like I was much adrift typically. And so since the game changer's been introduced, we've like tripled the amount of content in the game in very short order, basically. And changed a lot of actually the kind of the meta level design of the thing too. And so I was definitely just starting to feel like,
is this good?
Is this good? Am I off my fucking rocker? Like, I hope this is correct.
So Natalie whiffed it.
So in terms of the gameplay and like the world interactions and the exploration and stuff, I think it's nailing it. Good. But
oh no,
there's a huge whiff when it comes to the interface. Because the game is really complex. It's not like the original game where you just have your crafting station and like pretty much you spend your time looking at one crafting station, and you have several others, but almost all of your time at an even point is just in one crafting station, right?
They're very tiered. So you hit your next one and then you kind of just ignore the rest of them you have.
Yeah. Yeah. In the original game, you built your next crafting station, and then that's just where you operate. Well, in Crashlands 2, there's a lot more interconnected kinds of systems. So there are different artisans that can craft different things, but they're persistent. So it's not like at some point you're just done with this artisan and you move on to the next artisan. You actually have them both, or all three of them, or however many there are, and they are relevant throughout the gameplay. And some of them will have recipes or things that you need to craft that are interdependent. So, you'll need to like craft something at one artisan and then bring that to another artisan and craft a thing there, and then go to a third artisan and then use that stuff to do research to unlock a thing at the first one, right? So it's like there's a lot of these interdependencies, but trying to keep all of that in my brain all at once, right, and remember what I would like, the path that I was going, the path of dependencies that I'm going down, while flipping between these UIs, like talk to one artisan, go talk to another one, the cognitive load was very high, right? And so it sucks because the stuff that's going on behind the scenes is really cool and interesting and complex, but the way that we've presented it is complicated.
Yes.
Right. And what we want is now to basically look at that and say, okay, we need a simple way for the player to engage with this complex system so that they can gain all the benefits of having lots of interesting interconnected decisions to make, but without the cost of having to remember a million things at the same time.
Yeah. So Adam, to your point about that blood altar thing in V Rising, which is basically just a big list that then gives you priority items, right? It's almost like what we currently have in Crashlands compared to that is essentially like if you were to split out, that whole list, split it into like a bunch of different pieces and scatter those to a couple of different entry points as far as like you pop up a new eye, you're like, okay, I want to kill that thing because it gives me this. And then I need that for this other thing. So you kind of start doing this like really challenging.
And I think most, like really actually all crafting games I've ever played suffer from this.
You'll have some
thing,
of this.
right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And how much they suffer depends on a lot of the details, but I'm starting to feel the same thing now because V Rising actually has a small number of kinds of workstations, right? But it's still like, 6 or something like that you build up over time. And then they can be upgraded and all of that. And so, and you do still have to, like if there's something you want to make, something you want to get, you still have to know, okay, which of the stations. And sometimes it's obvious because there's like a grinder and it's like, okay, well, I want to make bone dust. So I'm going to put bones in that makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. But sometimes it's like, oh, I need to make like a stick of dynamite, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
So which of these maps? And so there are a few items that like my wife and I, as we were playing, were just like, we could never fucking remember which one of the stations, the certain thing we had to go to get the thing. But then also because some of the more like interesting stuff, like your higher tier pieces of armor and that kind of stuff require a whole bunch of components, right? That are all like hard to make. They require a lot of grinding or finding rare things or whatever. But then you're like, okay, now where did I put those things? Like, in what chests will I find the ones I already have? And in what stations do I go to make the other parts? So that a lot of what you end up doing is just being like, oh, fuck, I forgot. What was the third thing in this list? Yeah,
which is too bad, right? Because the whole thing is like, so you're going to have some degree of this, like you said, as you get basically a complex game that has a lot of breadth. You'll run into this at some point, but it is frustrating that it starts happening usually at the point where you have like the most variety and cool stuff going on. You start losing like the capacity to actually engage with it in a way that's very, very fun, as opposed to that capacity staying this constant.
Yeah, I think it's a core failure point because like for me, from my own experience playing, because I love crafting games, but the main thing that kicks me out of every crafting game I've ever played is at some point inventory management and the cognitive load of trying to figure out how and where to do things just gets so high that I hate coming back to my base after adventuring. Because like because like also as these games open up, because you always have a limited inventory, right? And as the game gets more interesting, part of what they do to make that more interesting is having more kinds of stuff. But if you have more kinds of stuff, you have your inventory fills up faster, right? Because you become able to harvest more things that you couldn't before. So like you just keep on being able to get more and more different stuff. It's like, so part of how V Rising held this at bay for a while is by not having a weight limit on and having a pretty healthy size of an inventory. But now 12 hours in, it's at the point where now if you go out on an overnight run and you're just like harvesting stuff and killing things and doing normal stuff, now you're not deciding like, oh, like I made it this far. Do I come back home to like recoup and make some potions or whatever before I go do this boss fight? But you're now like, well, if I fight this boss, I won't have any inventory space to put the loot that I'm in. So I guess I have to go home now, right? Or start throwing inventory up.
Yeah, and to be clear, like this can be a fun, like this whole element can be very fun in terms of like basically management of inventory or making these choices about kind of what you're doing. But the game context matters a ton, because if you're trying to get a lot of tension going, so you got your Resident Evil, stuff like that, where like you have a limited backpack and you can only fit like a certain number of things. And that matches perfectly with like the tenor of what's happening. You know what I mean? You got to really make some hard choices as you're carrying like a big thing that's rocket launcher or some shit versus a bunch of, medicinal herbs to heal yourself or something.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing about crafting games is that those limits are diametrically opposed to the point, right? And it's always that, and it can still be made more or less interesting in a crafting game context, but you're right that like in other contexts where things are just really limited in general because it's part of the game. It's not a crafting game. There's not a fuckload of kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
then inventory management can be an
could be
interesting
interesting.
game
Yeah, it can be an ad,
mechanic.
for sure.
Yeah. But in a crafting game, it's always a shitty experience that just gets shittier. And I think like in original Crashlands, that was one of the things that we tried to solve by having your unlimited inventory that just sorts itself and all that kind of stuff, right? And I think that was very helpful. And I think it seems like V Rising, where V Rising gives you reasons to come home because the sun will kill you, right? Right? Because part of the discussion we've always had is like, well, if we take away all of inventory limits, right, so that you can just go out and like adventure forever, then what's the incentive to go home? How do we make that part of like the interesting game loop, right? And that's what I think is like so cool about what V Rising did is that they still have those limits, but they don't need to because they could take them away now. And it would be still really interesting because
you
the
still have a
primary
cadence.
decision, you have a cadence still. And you still want to build your castle because the castle building is interesting and fun. And like as you build new stuff, it unlocks new things. So now you can like build a coffin that you can put a servant into, right? You like charm a person, put them into a servant coffin, and they convert them into a servant over after like an hour or whatever. And so they have these like interesting things you can do in your castle, right?
Yeah.
And so that becomes like the drive, and that's also where all your crafting stuff is. So like that becomes
Running
the
out of
driving
space is just not. It's not fun.
It's not fun.
Most of the time. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's you want it to be the case that the player goes back to their home base because they want to, because they have some next thing that they want to do there versus despite having things that they want to keep doing out in the world, it would be pointless to do those things unless they go back and basically do some administrative work.
Yeah.
Right. It's like
There's other really fun ways to apply some pressure, which we haven't experimented yet. As far as like death mechanics in Crashlands 2, it's currently you just show back up, you don't lose anything, etc.
just reappear back home. Man.
Yeah. But this is one of the things I want to experiment with on that side of things too, because you can also basically add essentially what is a constantly building positive pressure to return home by doing something like if you die, then like say you just nuke some portion of a person's held inventory, which is the benefit of having an entire infinite inventory. The idea is like, it costs you a suite of the things you've been picking up.
Yeah, if you drop all of it and then permanently lose some of it, that would be because that's a good example of like because in V Rising you drop your loot, so you still have to go back and get it, which then because that's something that normally I think of as being pretty sucky, but in the right context it can be good because now like, well, where do you die and drop your loot? It's like always when you're at the edge of a challenge, right? So like now a new story comes into play, which is you trying to get back to your body to get your loot, right? Which is then interesting again. And so if you do like Sam, what you're saying, where you still have your inventory that you carry with you, because in OG Crashlands, the inventory was just an inventory, right? Like it was universal. It wasn't, you didn't like dump stuff into it. Like
it's just an infinite inventory, which means it operates
inventory.
like a stack of coins or something like that. So
yeah,
if you die,
having
you
a
just lose
system
half your
where
stack.
having a system where you actually have an inventory on you that's also infinite, but that it is not safe if it's just on you, right?
Yeah, if it's not safe, then you build up positive pressure to return home and bank it, right? Bank your progress over time, which can be really cool. So yeah, I do want to try that. I don't know, full disclaimer, who knows if that's going to stick, but
this is literally just like a random conversation.
It's got to, because that's what's happening the rest of the game and all that. Yeah. But it's a constant thing we always talk about with crafting games is like, how do you deal with inventory? And I honestly just don't think, I think it's been in some context done like okay enough, but always there's a point. Like the reason I don't play Valheim anymore is because like once you get into like the iron tier, basically, it just feels like the only thing I'm fucking doing is managing inventory. Like I go out for 2 seconds and I'm like, oh, now my inventory is full, right? And then I come back home and then I'm like, okay, now I've got literally like 30 chests, right? All filled to the brim with stuff.
Yeah.
Which one do I? It's just a cognitive nightmare.
Well, it's weird, right? Because like crafting games, survival games, like they're about stuff.
Yeah.
They're about
the collection and conversion of stuff. But
yeah. And all of them do a lot of work to give you just tons of different kinds of stuff. All kinds of stuff that does all kinds of things, just piles of stuff, millions and millions of pounds of stuff. And none of them really go out of their way to make it so that having more stuff isn't a problem.
Yep.
Right? Like getting stuff is supposed to be a positive thing because that's the whole point of one of these kinds of games.
I think part of it is because of where these things show up as far as how they hit a player emotionally, which is like, so actually to your point, you were like, oh, like as far as like actually the game experience, the playing of the game moment to moment, it's actually nailing it. currently, Crashlands 2. On like
Yeah, it's fun to go out in the world and just fight things and harvest things.
The reality
explore.
is that if you're actually nailing one of these emotional experiences that people can have, it's actually rare enough that by and large what that means is that you can get away with like
you could just stop there.
you just stop. You get away with like
sure, yeah, like the part when you're at your home base, that part sucks.
Yeah, but like
it's fun enough to be out in the world.
Yeah, you'll pay your taxes. You know what I mean?
Well,
Come back and
and that's exactly it. It's like the reason I played like games like Terraria and like Valheim as long as I did was because the rest of the game was so compelling and so much fun that I could put up with how shitty that part was longer, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there still always comes a point, and where that is going to depend on the person and all that, right? But there always comes a point where that part sucks so much that it just overwhelms, and that's kind of shitty, right? Because that means that my end experience of all of these crafting games
is getting
tired, just being tired. Yeah, and I'm just like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm just doing chores now, right? And so then like that's what I leave the game with. And so like with Valheim, like when I think about Valheim now, I used to like for the first like literally 30 hours of gameplay or whatever, I was always so excited. Like I couldn't wait to get back in, like figure out the next thing to do, get to the next place, you know, and then there came a point at like hour 45 or 50 or something where if my wife was like, hey, should we play Valheim? That like I would actually have a sense of dread. Like that was the emotional response I had, right? Which
because if you haven't,
especially
if you haven't played one of those games in a while, you come back to your save and you open up you go into your base and it's just like, it's just like 30 chests. And it's just like, what am I doing?
And now you're
What's
like
in all
farming
of these?
stuff too. So now it's like, now you have a whole system where it's like, oh no, we have like our farms where we're currently growing carrots. Like, what are we growing carrots for? It's like, probably to make some stews or something. So it's like, do I need to harvest all these carrots? And you're like, oh, well, if I've harvested these carrots, now I got to go replant some seeds,
more stuff.
you know? So like, now like just the sheer amount of stuff becomes overwhelming over time.
It just becomes, it goes from like fun world exploration simulator to just ever increasing chores simulator. I guess in a way, it very much like simulates the journey through life, you know, like
but
at the beginning,
point of games is to escape that though. You know?
Well, at the beginning, everything is new and exciting and you're just out in the world. You're just happy to be here. But then over time, you just have chores, more and more chores just land on your plate.
Sucking the life out of you.
You know?
Yeah, I think that there's a real question. Yeah, there's a real question, which is like, okay, so basically what you're saying is that you could not invest in this at all and just be like, yeah, the UI is kind of weird and wacky and like whatever, deal with it. But the core experience is good enough. So why choose to invest? And I think the important thing is because no one else does, which means that if you deliver on an experience like that, then it'll have enough of actually a different feel to it, an importantly different feel that I think imparts a bit of sort of unique magic to it. But two, I think is more important, which is that you don't know what's on the other side of solving this stupid inventory problem. What I mean by that is certain design things can't happen. They just cannot happen until a particular foundational shift occurs within the game. So it might be like, it may look a little silly to invest in this thing that like people can deal with, but there might be some piece beyond it that it's actually basically groundwork. Solving that problem is groundwork for enabling that actually makes the overall emotional experience so much more interesting and layered and even like just better. And you, unfortunately, oftentimes you cannot see these things until you get the damn boulder, in this case, inventory management, cognitive overload, out of the way. And then these other things start opening up in really spectacular ways. Mm-hmm. That's why.
Well, yeah, but also there's a framing piece of this too, which is that it's really easy. It's like the way that you said it just now was like, well, we nailed the core experience, so who cares about this other piece, right? It's very easy as a developer to think about like one part of your game as like the gameplay, and then this other part of your game as not the gameplay. It's just some other thing that's happening, right? But both of them influence each other a ton, like Sam is saying. And so if you stop thinking about like what is the core experience of the game and how do we deliver on that, instead just say like, what is just the experience of the game? I mean, this like, what is it like to play the game overall? Yeah. And are there parts that suck?
This goes back to our discussion last week about the work experience, right?
Yeah,
and about the problem of focusing on if you believe that your work is like, I'm a programmer, so my work is hitting keyboard keys to cause code to exist. And that's it, right? And so everything else is not the work. That's the stuff that's in the way or stuff that's to get done first or whatever. And you don't
have to worry about spending time improving those things because that's not the core
It's a
experience.
waste of time because it's not the core experience, right? But that's including like all the things that go into like checking your email, doing all of the. How do you tell somebody else you need help from them, right? Like all of those little components that make up your overall work experience. It's the same deal with playing games. It's like those are all central because if anything is bad, it just contaminates and fucks with all of the rest of it.
And you hear that a lot. People are like, "Oh man, I love working here, but like we use Jira for task management, and it makes me want to fucking die." And it's like, well, that's kind of a big part of the whole thing. You know what I mean?
Well, managing tasks that's what work is.
So like, what is maybe take a second, check it out.
So it's all the same, and like that. Yeah, that philosophy of how we try to design our work life and our work and everything else, like that does cascade into how we try to think about our game designs, which is everything influences everything. And if you just flat out ignore one piece of it, then like Sam said, you don't know what's actually on the other side once you fix that problem and a whole new world opens up. What is that world? I have no idea. That's the whole point. You got to do it. So that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Jen Coster, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.